And so on and so on. And so on and so on. And so on and so on.
If I don't, so like my razors get dull. They get dull. They get dull, and when I'm like when you have to shave like every part of your fucking face, and you've got a dull razor, like you just get nicked, and you get nicked, and you get nicked. And the thing about the razors that you're going back to, what do you think they're doing when they're just sitting in a little drawer? They're fucking. There's bacteria. It's just they get oxidized. Yes.
They only get oxidized if they're wet.
I'm telling you guys, using a dirty old razor is not.
No, I'm not proud of it.
Yeah, you're confusing this admission with being proud.
This is not an endorsement per se. This is just a way of life. When did you get the impression that I'm proud of the way I behave? And then Peter and I could learn it, and then we'd do a Žižek and so on in German.
Auf Deutsch.
Yeah, Žižek und
You dye your hair
Žižek
blonde.
und so on.
I came up with, I think, a very hilarious phrase in French. So, if you're searching for a man named Serge, in French you say je cherche. Wait, je cherche Serge.
Je cherche Serge.
Je cherche Serge.
Yeah. She cherche, but she cherche Serge.
And je suis Peter, and we got Jake and Will, and this is Žižek and Zolan.
So on.
And Zolan. I forget what that means in German, but it is a
Sollen,
German
yeah,
word.
Sollen.
And today we're talking about the parallax, a very kind of key idea in Žižek's particular constellation.
In the late Žižek, I think.
Yeah, starting I believe with the book Parallax View. I'm not sure he mentions it before that at all. 2006.
The Parallax View, the Parallax object, all of them have a unique placeholder in, I think, like his method. You know, not only of his like, I think, overall thought and philosophy, but also key to his style of intervention. Perhaps even a way of describing his intervention is the parallax. Peter, isn't there a movie from like the 70s called The Parallax View?
Yeah, it's I think it's actually what the book is named after, and it's a fantastic movie. Recommend to anyone who likes kind of paranoid 70s cinema. It just kind of captures a kind of vague paranoia without really tying it to a particular political orientation, which is kind of like, I think, speaks to the 70s in general in terms of like where the kind of popular culture was at in terms of understanding the structures and ideology, etc.
There's no better example, but I know that we have a few others that I think will flesh out this idea of parallax. Before we go on to our listeners, we're doing a book club this weekend. The first ever meeting. It's through our Discord, which can be accessed by our Patreon. So if you like what you hear, you can sign up for our Patreon. And this week we're starting a book club, which I hope will continue, just continue going on through particular Žižekian works, and then perhaps beyond into other thinkers in that sort of constellation of thinkers. But this week we're starting with the sublime object of ideology, right?
A classic.
A classic. A fucking classic. And a book that I think deserves a nice, slow, dialectical walkthrough. So we're starting with chapter 1 this weekend, and you can access that through our Discord.
Good plug there, Jake.
Thanks, baby.
Do you want...
It hurts to do,
yeah.
but we did it.
It's like plugging teeth. So maybe...
I've never done that.
So yeah, I think we could kind of touch on different examples of a parallax. Not only that Žižek touches on in Parallax View, but also a few that we kind of came up with ourselves. But maybe just a brief definition, kind of working definition, to orient those examples. Anyone want to read that quote?
Yeah, well, this reading comes from is it the introduction to the book, The Parallax View?
It's the beginning of the book, yeah.
The beginning of the book. So at the beginning, Žižek says, the common definition of parallax is the apparent displacement of an object, the shift of its position against a background, caused by a change in observational position that provides a new line of sight. And then he goes on to say that the philosophical twist to be added is that the observed difference is not simply subjective, due to the fact that the same object which exists out there is seen from two different stations or points of view. It is rather that, as Hegel would have put it, subject and object are inherently mediated, so that an epistemological shift in the subject's point of view always reflects an ontological shift in the object itself. How'd I do?
That's good. It really cuts to the core of Žižek's whole approach, right? Like the position of the subject is like of prime importance here as a kind of ontological claim, as a like insofar as you can make claims about objects, quote unquote, out there, it's always from a particular angle, and that applies not only to just kind of phenomenological perception, but also like epistemological and ontological claims as well.
Yeah, and I think therefore it also orients the question, the ontological question as well. And that's something that we'll get into later, I think, with Heidegger. But what Žižek is doing here is like he's kind of positioning the ontological question in relation to certain things, and not as either a transcendental plane or perhaps an epistemological category.
Right, and then I think in this case, there's not necessarily an understanding of a fundamental ontology as centered on an absolute. What this type of ontology is based on is sort of a negativity or a difference, as opposed to a kind of centralized truth. It seems that what the parallax, like in its abstract common definition, is that it's about displacement and it's about a shift, as opposed to the two kind of concretized or stable viewpoints. It's about the mediation between them, where the ontology lies, where being is exposed, but inherently is something negative or is something withdrawn, as something not fully there or complete. And that I think why it's so interesting is because in this reading that we did, which is right, like you said at the beginning of the Parallax, Žižek mentions Heidegger in a kind of like, it's very infrequent that Heidegger is mentioned in Žižek's work. But for a good reason, I think, in this discussion, late Heidegger becomes kind of important, because we have a discussion of a fundamental ontology, but that's based no longer on, discovering being, approaching being, capital B being, but kind of seeing where it isn't. Seeing where when you're looking for it, the idea is that, you're not finding it is in fact the fundamental ontology,
and how to speak of being involves speaking from a particular position.
Right, that's exactly it. Yeah.
Which is not something that you would associate with Heidegger's approach, I don't think.
Oh no, that's actually where he thinks his Heidegger is limited. The place of enunciation rather. But and then a particular twist he adds to that definition you read earlier is he says, or to put it in Lacanese, the subject's gaze is always already inscribed into the perceived object, in the guise of its blind spot, that which is in the object more than itself, the point from which the object itself returns the gaze. I was reading that quote just now, and when he says blind spot, I had a moment where I made it literal. It's like if you look at an object, there is a blind spot. You can't see the whole object ever. Right, and that particular absence in the totality of being of perceiving the object not only allows you to see it, but is a kind of claim about the kind of incompleteness of the object itself.
That's exactly it, right? And so from a even keeping Heidegger still in the wings here, the idea is that you cannot because beings are particularized, you cannot access them in their totality at any point in time. And point and time being operative here. Like, because as speaking of Lacan, there is no meta language, right? There's correlationism, right? You cannot at any point be outside of your position in order to see it in this kind of like quasi objective way. And Peter, I know that you have a better way of formulating this, but like you can't at any point you cannot be conscious, you can't step outside the point of observation to observe your point of observation. And so like inherently in an object there is a blind spot. But why Lacan here is a nice foil for Hegel is because this kind of blind spot is excessive, right? There's something about the object itself that involves the gaze of the subject and the returning gaze of the object that becomes excessive. There's something in the object that is more than just the object itself. So you have beings in their particularity, and then you have this sense of a totality, but inaccessible totality, right? It's the excessive part of the object, yeah.
It's like the dark side of the moon, right? Like the dark side of the moon exists only as a concept from our particular position looking at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good example.
That's exactly it. Yeah, that's exactly it. Well,
and like he's getting at here what Heidegger calls the ontological difference, right? It's the distinction between being with a capital B and beings with a small b, the ontological and the ontic. But in classic Žižekian fashion, or perhaps Hegelian fashion, he goes on to say that the ontological difference is actually inscribed in the position of the subject. So rather than being some capital B being like a higher entity, which is always kind of the, I think, disavowed aspect to Heidegger's sort of philosophical edifice, is that you can't help but think that being with a capital B exists almost on a kind of transcendental level.
Exactly.
But Žižek says that Heidegger, in a sense, misses the difference and reduces being to a higher entity, and he sees that there's a parallel which exists with the movement from Kant to Hegel here, that the ontological difference could be understood to be actually inscribed in the thing itself.
Yeah, and maybe we can parse the Kant and Hegel dynamic there a bit more in a minute, but we were.
Well, I wanted to say one thing to that, and then I think we will hit the examples. But what's interesting, what's important about the Žižekian turn here, and I think this is based on Hegel and Lacan, is that in fundamental ontologies up to a certain point, there's like that lurking kind of moralistic hierarchy, right? Mm-hmm. That beings in their particularity are always, lesser than the capital B being, the absolute, the transcendental. But like this turn on the subject, right? The importance of the subject in the parallax and in Žižekian thought brings, and this is based on Hegel, right? The only access we have, or in fact, our barred access to this, supposedly fundamental transcendental being, or the concept or the idea, is in the incomplete material, right? And that's such an important part of the parallax.
And because for Heidegger, obviously he doesn't use the category of the human or the subject. Heidegger talks about Dasein, which is the kind of privileged site of the revealing of being. But Jake, compared to what you were just saying and what Lacan is saying, it's a very different sort of inflection of what that subject is to say that it's a negative category or a lacking category or barred category. And this is where the parallax comes in, I think.
Yeah.
And it's also, clearly a kind of way of framing the Hegelian system. But just to what you were saying in terms of the whole or being characterized or understood via a particular angle, we were talking yesterday. We were trying to come up with examples of this in pop culture, and we settled on the Coen brothers as like a fantastic iteration of the parallax, because most of the plots of Coen brothers movies revolve around some sort of mistake and some sort of failure for people to understand what like their like role in this situation that is entirely like incomprehensible beyond their unintentional actions within it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
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 And we were talking about Burn After Reading, where like each character is entirely necessary to the unfolding of the plot, but understands what is happening completely separately from one another. So Brad Pitt thinks that it's like some sort of secret government plot, and the other woman thinks that it's about her like plastic surgery, right?
Yeah.
What's that actress's name?
Frances McDormand.
Yeah, she's like trying to get body augmentation, so that's how she understands the story. And then George Clooney, it's all about adultery, and like all of these things are
Not to
unfolding.
mention John
John
Malkovich.
Malkovich. This is a fucking crucifixion.
That's a really good impression.
where everything, regardless of the narrative, you know,
It's an
from those two
injustice.
perspectives, just happens to him.
Yeah.
Like, no matter how, like, yeah.
And then the kind of blind bureaucracy of the state, at the same time. So like everyone,
Well,
and
then there's the love too between the
Yeah.
gym owner and Frances McDormand's character. Yeah.
and everyone's acting in relation to one another, but not one of those stories is correct. And then at the end of the movie, the guy with the mustache, he's like, "So what did we learn?" He's like trying to figure out what the meaning of it all is, but it's like that's it. There isn't one.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And at each turn, you know, when each narrative is described, you know, the end of each narrative is relayed to the, you know, the head. What is it? The head of this, like the CIA.
Yeah.
He's just like, what the fuck? Yeah. Like, does
And
that,
you know,
It's like the
That's,
ending.
that's the big other. That's the there is no big other. I mean, he kind of plays that role, but there's no understanding on his part. He doesn't understand
Right,
the
exactly.
narrative.
The incapacity or inability to comprehend like the coordinates of the situation persists all the way to the end of the film. And you don't, like you just said, you
And
don't
it's
learn
fucking
more.
hilarious.
Yeah. But there is another example I thought of from the world of film, and I know Jake, you have maybe a literary example later on. And this is a bit of a tangent, but I was trying to think of a film which might sort of enact the parallax view, and I thought that The Conversation might actually do this. The Francis Ford Coppola film from I think 1973, I want to say, Between the Two Godfathers. The first scene of the movie is Gene Hackman's character, and he's got a lot of sophisticated recording equipment with a number of helpers who are recording a conversation between two unknown people who are in this square in New York City, and they're trying to finagle the equipment to get the reception so they can hear the conversation. And over the course of the film, he's sort of doctoring this tape and trying to get the best sort of rendition of the conversation. But the conversation itself is something that you actually hear from the first scene of the film, and you hear it all the way through the film. And then finally you hear it again after you've learned kind of what the conversation is quote unquote about. So repeatedly the film goes back through, I think, another Žižekian thing of the partial object in the audio recording. Like we hear their voices. And through this we learn what's at stake in the conversation, which brings to mind a quote from Lacan that Žižek mentions in this reading, where Lacan says, "The telling of the non-all truth does not imply that we keep some part of truth secret. Its obverse is that there is nothing we did not tell." So Gene Hackman isn't trying to find out the truth of the conversation. He's trying to find the correct perspective from which the inconsistencies of the conversation will be made comprehensible. I think that's a crucial point.
wow. Yeah.
And then he becomes implicated
Yeah,
in the conversation.
Yeah,
He finally hears a crucial element.
right. Well, we see like it's not. There is a kind of epistemological shift for Gene Hackman's character as he comes to understand what the conversation is about in his attempts to figure out the underlying message of the conversation. But it's also reflected in an ontological shift in the object itself, where the conversation, which is still the same object, is changed over the course of the film. So we can see that the conversation, which is here the parallax object, could be interpreted from a multitude of perspectives, but the message is not simply the true message, the capital T true message of what they're actually talking about. The climax of the movie attests to this sort of core of what is potentially the correct perspective on what they're actually talking about, and which I think is crucially like it's not just in the service of truth. Like, for instance, a movie from the same decade, All the President's Men, which I think is a crock of liberal shit.
I finally directed by the same director as Parallax View.
Oh, really?
Pollock?
Oh, is it?
Yeah, yeah. Which is weird because Parallax View is so much more interesting than All President's Men.
Yeah, so it's forcing this message down our throats, which is apt because the character who's the mouthpiece of truth is called Deep Throat. So, but yeah, so what I'm trying to say is the conversation I think attests to this parallax of the subject, Gene Hackman's involvement in the object, and the object's involvement in him, the character, as well. Does that make any sense?
The conversation initially is captured from a variety of perspectives. There's no like beyond you, the viewer, who actually like gets a semi kind of voyeuristic look at the unfolding of the conversation itself. There's never like the conversation as it stands beyond the particular moments in which it's captured, and then that capturing changes throughout the film and also begins to implicate Gene Hackman, thus drawing him into the plot of what the conversation actually is about.
Yeah, it's not that you don't know enough, because actually all the content is there in the conversation to understand it from the point of view of the message of the conversation. But you're struggling with, and this is actually maybe something we can talk about, the parallax, and something I was trying to get to there. It's like, it's not about the relativity of the positions. That's not really what the parallax is.
To pose the question of the parallax is because it's very important that we clarify that parallax, I think from first blush, can kind of be related to a general concept of liberal relativism, right? Which is obviously politicized, right? Especially in the contemporary world, right? That everyone has their perspective, and that is the truth, right? Is that the truth, especially in liberal arts educations, is located in the fact that like a text, can be read from an infinite number of perspectives. And I think that what this classic kind of relativism misses is what actually gives rise to or constitutes relativism in the first place. And that's where the parallax lies. Mm-hmm. So relativism says you have one viewpoint on the same thing, and I have one viewpoint on the same thing. And that's okay. That's where the truth lies. But parallax says, well, what allows for a thing to be seen from multiple perspectives in the first place? What is it about this given thing? And risking another example that Žižek brings up, it's Theodor Adorno's analysis of the antagonistic character of society. Very basically, is society a collection of individuals, which, is it made up of a collection of individuals first, or is it a totality that pre-exists these individuals? And the idea is that it's not one, society, capital S society in itself is not locatable. It's not something that you can articulate in a particular perspective. It's society itself that bars our ability to articulate it, right? It's the irreconcilable antagonism between the totality and the individual that is the truth, not one or the other perspective on what or definition of what society is. And so your point about the conversation is true here, right? It's like, well, what exactly is the message? What exactly is the message of the conversation? The idea is that there is no particular exact message. It's that there is only the potential for it to be seen as saying different things.
Right.
But what gives rise to that is what the parallax is, not just the different ways of it being heard. Because ultimately, the exact content that the audience hears is also should be subjected to the parallax, right?
Yeah. Because you are like, on a kind of meta way, a particular viewer of the conversation, the same way that Gene Hackman is.
Yeah, and the conversation means different things throughout the film. You think they're talking about one thing. You think that they're being persecuted in the first version of the conversation, and then you find at the end that they're actually conspiring about something. It's in fact the opposite.
Back to the importance of there is no neutral, objective position. It's always the subject, right?
Yeah.
Subjectivity
always
has
not,
to
but it's
be...
not always the subject either, because it's not a pure kind of subjectivism, because it's the dynamic not only of different angles, but that space between the different angles and the object itself.
That's exactly it.
So what you're saying about social antagonism, it's not either the totality or the individuals. It's that the tension between the two.
And
that
that's
makes
also
society.
a general
Yeah.
claim, or could also be applied to class struggle. Kind of
Exactly, which we'll hit. We're going to hit later.
And it looks
hit that
different. The shape of the scenario looks different depending on where you are. I mean, almost physically, right? And Parallax has this kind of spatial, visible valence to it.
It's like in Claude Levi-Strauss when he's describing a kind of anthropological description of a town, and
I believe it's a village.
it's okay, sorry. We don't have to get into the antimony between towns and villages, but
it's the tension between town and village.
He asked
Kibbutz.
the kind of general village population, townsfolk, of to draw the town physically on the ground, and depending on where they fell in the social hierarchy, the town itself looked differently to different people. And then he asked like the kind of rulers of the town to draw it, and they viewed like themselves in the kind of the center of the town and everything else existing around them, whereas the other people viewed it in kind of two halves. There was the people who controlled the town and the people who were like their subjects.
Right. So the imbalance of social relations prevents the community from stabilizing itself in a harmonious idea of what their town looks like. And so the idea is there's not an actual arrangement of the town. There's not an objective arrangement, because that objective arrangement's impossible. You cannot step outside and see of your viewpoint and see the town as it objectively is. The real, as Žižek says, is the traumatic core of a social antagonism, of a parallax which distorts reality, right? In accord with a given set of ideological coordinates.
Right. Because even a map of a town wouldn't describe the objective reality of the town, right?
Yeah, it's like when you're in somewhere new, in a new place, and you're trying to figure out like you're just walking around, you're trying to figure out the arrangement of things. It's like when you first get there, it's a confusing, like blurry mess, and then when you find your own kind of relationship to it, it completely rearranges itself.
But this has a lot of implications for like what we consider to be objective, right? That there are notions of, especially like in the modern era, like the absolute ideological power of science as the objective tool to understand things as they really are.
Right.
And in society, this is just the way that it is. This is just the way that this works. It says a lot about what we kind of, ideologically, what we inherit as coordinates of neutral objective standpoints, when in reality there is no such thing. And so that what we consider to even be, the most or closest to an objective viewpoint is perhaps maybe the most aggressive form of
right. And a perfect example of that is the Borges short story of the king's map makers, who make a map so big it actually covers the territory which it depicts, right? And that's exactly what you were just saying. I think the kind of aggressive nature to the imposition of a certain frame of rendering the social space.
Because scientifically speaking, in order to understand the world as something that you can kind of take hold of and measure means that you're automatically implying that the world is measurable. That's like your starting presupposition. But I was going to ask Jake, and you referenced it briefly, but like, what do you think the dynamic is then between the parallax and ideology? Because like when we're viewing objects from a particular angle, Žižek also speaks extensively about how like our view itself, our positionality itself, is always already mediated through a particular ideological framework, symbolic universe. So like, how then is the symbolic is like given expression through the subject as a kind of overlay onto the object that the subject is viewing? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
As a question.
It does. Well, I feel like I really want to answer that, but I also think that we can answer it by going through Kant and Hegel and the movement between those two, and then discussing Lacan, because in order to get to how ideology plays into a subject's position and its relationship to the objective world, and the ideological mediation that isn't just like happenstance or it is arbitrary and contingent, but also incredibly necessary, right? That there is no immediate neutral objective world from which we're alienated. It's that there's a relationship between that world and the subject that is constitutive, that makes ideology constitutive as a mediation. It needs to be mediated. And what I think, just to answer your question, kind of like in a, I don't know, more like a formal way, it's just that ideology seems to be a kind of determination or ordering through a fantasy that is based around the efficacy of a particular ideological structure and its master signifiers, right? So when I think about the symbolic and its relationship to the real, which we would just like understand traditionally as this neutral, immediate, the reality beneath our fantasies. It's like there is no real per se. It's not an object. It's not a neutral, immediate experience or thing that we can experience directly. It needs to be mediated and experienced indirectly through our symbolic coordinates, right? And through fantasy. So the parallax, if anything, actually really helps one understand the importance of ideology, not as something that is, purely like in a political category and that can be, kind of like, what's the word? Like just dissected and understood and analyzed and like we can shed our ideologies and get toward the capital T truth. We can access the real. Ideology is necessary. And so why it's really important, the parallax is important to understand the Žižekian method, is because Žižek can frustrate people insofar as there seems to be in the immediacy of his intervention a kind of the ability to flip-flop, the ability to say, let's wait and see. We don't, in fact, know the truth yet of something, because that is the parallax's intervention, right? That is understanding a way of approaching the real, the happenings of the world indirectly, trying to weigh the fact that not one perspective on history is true, but that the difference between perspectives is really where the critique lies. So ideology is, of course, important, and I think we'll get to that. That's my limping answer to your question, but we can.
It's a good answer. What also made me think of was like, because ideology is also, and this is what he's talking about. This is what he talks about in the Sublime Object, is that like the object is still operative in the ideology as a traumatic kind of like linchpin of the symbolic order. So like there's still like a mediation between the subject and object through ideology, but that it's possible or impossible insofar as the symbolic space is the kind of realm of ideology. Right.
And I think just because we're speaking Lacan here, it's really important to understand that there's not a chronology necessary of the orders. It's a Borromean knot, right? The symbolic, the real, and the imaginary there's a simultaneity, right? It's not like as if the real, we can presuppose the real before the symbolic or before the imaginary. All of these things happen together. They prop one another up. And this is why we should talk about Kant and Hegel.
Well, one more point, just dovetailing off that. He sees this as, like also present in the way that we deem the subject. The three sort of inflections of the term subject correspond to the triad, the Lacanian triad, right? So he says that the very term subject has three main meanings: subject as an autonomous agent, subject as this same agent submitted or subjected to some power or topic, and subject matter. It's not difficult to recognize, he goes on, in these three meanings, the triad of the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. Pure subject as the answer of the real, a subject of the signifier, submitted to, caught into the symbolic order, the imaginary stuff that provides the matter, the content of the subject.
Boom.
So I guess a way of framing this, maybe this digression or something, I'm sorry, it was my question, but is understanding like that all this kind of occurs like within one, as Žižek understands it, the Kantian concept of the antimony, as well as Hegel's kind of solution to the impasse of the Kantian system, as he understands it.
Yeah.
So this is a dynamic between, how would we phrase it in that regard?
Between the phenomenal and the noumenal, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Between idealism and materialism, ultimately keeping it nice and short, Kant understands the limit to human reason is the object in itself, right? That we can rationalize that there is an object in and itself, but we have no access to it. This is reason's limit. And
I find that, very briefly, I find this point is very well articulated by Wittgenstein, who is somewhat Kantian at points. He says the limits of my language are the limits of my world. That I think that's just exactly that point, that there's a distinct limit on what the subject can know. It can't go beyond that. That constitutes the phenomenal world, and the noumenal is that which is utterly held at bay by
Right.
an
Which sounds pretty good.
It does.
Well,
But Jake, you were going to make a point
until
there. Sorry, go ahead.
well, no,
Hegel
just
comes
it's
along.
if you think about this kind of like, this like proverbial encounter between, the subject, you, and any object in your home. For me, it's always the coffee cup. But like, there is some sense simultaneously of the object's particularity, its being there, its simple there-ness, and what is in it that is beyond it, right? The object in itself that can't, like, I can perceive it, but I cannot necessarily know it.
This is what Kant calls the thing in itself, right?
The thing in itself, yeah. And so in the object itself, what Kant is getting at is that there's this tension between its particularity, its phenomenal character, this coffee cup, and its noumenal sense, how we can perceive in it the object in itself, this kind of dignity
Or
of
we
the
can't.
transcendental, right?
Yeah, the fact that we can't.
we can perceive it, but we can't know it, right? There's no way of communicating.
Yeah, the perception is forever within the phenomenal realm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so why Hegel is so important, and why Hegel takes, is more Kantian than Kant himself, right? Is the Žižekian trope, is that Hegel understands that the noumenal is only ever present in the incomplete phenomenal, right? And this is, which goes back to many conversations, why Plato is so important for Žižek, as instead of the kind of pure metaphysician, Plato is perhaps like a really good materialist, but that it's like,
Yeah, because the ideas are in the
ob-
material thing.
exactly, the form of the thing is only ever it's referenced in the in the what is it, the depleted or the incomplete, the deficient object, but Hegel says we only have access to the thing in itself, the form of the thing in its referent.
And because
so-
the thing in itself is incomplete. It's not because of the very process of being, of spirit, as a process, it means that the subject as well as objects, the world, is not totally what it is. It's not in itself.
Well, Hegel says what Kant says, but he says it differently. So Hegel sees the limit not of the phenomenal. It's the limit of the noumenal being exposed in the phenomenal, right? Because Kant actually says that, hey, there's this limit here, and Hegel's saying, yeah, but that limit is actually not of the object, but the limit is of the noumenal, right? The noumenal itself is incomplete.
Right. But I think he would also say that the gap between the phenomenal and the noumenal is there in the thing itself, as the thing itself, right? And that is the correspondence to the subject position, right? That's where the subject is in the gap.
What we sense as the
noumenal. Which is a point we've tried to get to many times on the podcast, but I think it's crucial to this understanding of the parallax, right? The interaction between the subject and the object, and the sort of movement between the two, the dialectic between the two. And maybe this is a point to talk about the objet petit from Lacan, because I think that really sort of mobilizes the point in a way that Žižek repeats ad infinitum.
Well, what we get is a change, like before heading into the objet petit, it's like what we get is a change in metaphysics, right? It is a change in the traditional understanding of metaphysics, right? And it hinges on that relationship between subject and object. It's like there's no longer the in itself of the object is no longer just a presupposed beyond, right? That the noumena or that the formal realm exists beyond the object, and the object itself is only a referent to it. It's that the noumenal or this beyond only exists in the gap between the noumenal and the phenomenal, right? So what we're sensing as the object in and of itself is actually the gap between the content and the form, between the object and its noumenal status, right? So being, in a Heideggerian sense, never is as a being, right? Is never as a lowercase being. It's like the withdrawal of capital B being allows for beings to be present. And so transferring to, but I mean, I feel like, did we hit the Hegelian thing hard enough, Pete? Do you want to fucking elbow that? You want to sleeper hold that?
Well, I mean, just because of the nature of the systems that we're talking about, each thing implies the other, and this is at once the brilliance of Žižek, as well as the danger in trying to speak of everything at once. But that it's that very dynamic between the pushing and pulling of things with each other and upon each other.
Right. The parallax is, he says, the third space between phenomena and noumenon. It's not that the object is removed, that the noumenal status of the object is removed from the object. It actually is in the object, but as the gap, as the inaccessible kernel of the gap between the phenomenal and the noumenal.
Yeah, it's not just that the noumenal's like in the object, it's that it's still in relationship to
it's
the
also
subject
experienced
position.
Yeah, the noumenal itself is something that is accessible through the experience of the object, but as the kind of
what we think is the noumenal is just the gap between the noumenal and the phenomenal.
I wonder
right?
how the noumenal corresponds to the category of the negative.
It's exactly it though, because it's the gap, negative. Right? It's the gap. Because what we experience as the noumenal, the thing in itself, is actually not the presence of the noumenal, it's the gap between the object and the noumenal.
Right. And I also wonder, therefore,
it's a negative. It's a negative.
And then I wonder what, like, in the science of logic, Hegel, to me, kind of resolves the age-old question of who's right, Heraclitus or Parmenides. Is being becoming or is being is, right? And Hegel says that becoming is the whole process of being sublating itself into something and reverting to nothingness and back again. It's this movement, and becoming is the whole movement. And I think maybe you could call that the parallax. I don't know.
But that's it's late Heidegger says, being in its withdrawal, that's the presencing aletheia, that's the presencing of beings. So only in its withdrawal, which is to say in the gap, right, between being proper and beings, in its withdrawal, beings' presence in becoming, they shine their light in aletheia, right? They're revealed, unconcealed, and then they return back to being proper, which is nothing, right? It's like only in its withdrawal, only within the the ontological withdrawal of being, do ontic things shine, and then they shine in becoming, and then they return back to being proper. Which for Heidegger, he realizes, oh fuck, being and nothing seem to be the exact same thing, right? Is that only in its withdrawal. Anyway, I need to get a drink of water.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
I mean, that's yeah.
But that's the Heraclitean.
I think that would be maybe a Hegelian reading of Heidegger.
That's a Heideggerian reading of Hegel.
You've always been a little high curious, Jake.
Yeah, it's
We could also note that what he's referencing specifically in Kant in this case is the antimony, which is something that isn't resolved. Like, Kant understands the antimony to be the impasse of the phenomenal and the noumenal, also empiricism and rationalism. And then what Hegel does is he kind of makes that antimony like the schematic in which he frames a system.
Yeah, hey, Kant's like, hey, there's irreconcilable antimony. Well, I say antimony.
Yeah. I think you can say both ways, but I think more people say antimony.
Antimony, that great Greek play. But like Kant's like, well, there's this irreconcilable antimony between the phenomenal and the noumenal, and that's just that's just the limit of our knowledge, right? That's an epistemological issue. And Hegel goes, actually, that epistemological shift there is an ontological one.
Bam.
Right?
There it is. Yeah, exactly.
Now, the objet petit, to me, is a really good way of understanding this Kant and Hegel, this epistemological to ontological shift, to better understand the real as a parallax. Because the objet petit, which, forever an elusive concept by Lacan, but I think intentionally so, is the object cause of desire. And what we have in Lacan is now we have this kind of relationship between the subject and an object, which I think the parallax really hinges on. The object cause of desire can be transubstantiated into the object of desire. So desire is a way of formulating the relationship between subject and object. We have a particular object that for a subject becomes the cause of its desire, and then the object of its desire. And the difference there is that the objet petit speaks to this unfathomable X, this variable, as Žižek calls it, in excess of the determinate status of a particular object. One can even go so far as to think of people who have fetishes for very unexplained weird things, right? Things that we couldn't imagine are the object cause of their desire, right? The focus of their libidinal investment. But what's important about the objet petit is it's not actually an object itself, but it is discovered in an object. It's not ever equal to particular properties of an object, to a thing, but the thing is in the object more than the object itself, right?
It's the thing
it's
the thing in the object that is the subject, and it's the thing in the subject that is the object, right?
Exactly. Right, right. Because often at times people are the object of desire, and so the object cause of desire for other people. So it's a thing in the object that's more than the object. It's beyond its very appearance, right? It's excessive definitively. And so Žižek says the objet petit is a pure parallax object. And why this is so is because it not only does the object status change with a shift in perspective, of a given subject, right? But it only exists, the objet petit only exists when viewed from that particular subjective position. So it's not an object that exists in the world, and now we can start to hear how this relates to the real, because it's not something that exists in the world per se, but it has a functioning, right? It's operative. It's not really there as a property or descriptive part of a particular object, but it is discovered in the object within the framework of a particular subject's desiring, their position, the particular position of enunciation.
So in addition to the parallax being a kind of ontological claim, it's also a claim about as a kind of method for Žižek. Žižek's method is a parallax method to theorizing, in that he positions theories from given angles. So how can we think of Lacan? Well, we can think of Lacan via Hegel and Marx as a position in which to inform another position, and that there's no for him he's not interested in providing a generic description of Hegel's system and Lacan's system and Marx's system, but it's what does each view inflect and inform upon the other?
How are they mediated?
Yeah.
Well, it's like it's like a subject-object positioning, right? It's like how does the gaze of Marx change Lacanian change the Lacanian text, right? Because there's something in each of these texts that's more than what they simply are, how they're symbolized, right? So there's there's something in them that causes a multiplicity of symbolic determinations and perspectives, but it's important that the particular subject and the particular object create a kind of dialectic, right? There's a dialectic process there, and that's the method.
And he gives a very good example of exactly what you're saying. He talks about Marx and the critique of political economy, as Marx's method, and he makes an interesting point that ultimately politics and economy are kind of radically different things. So like in some sense, political economy is almost an impossible method, but rather than kind of dismiss the possibility of there being such thing as a critique of political economy, he says that tension between politics and economy, that antimony, that parallax view is the success and the utility of the Marxist analysis.
Right. Well, that's the importance of Lacan, right? For Marx, is the category of the subject. It's not just a coincidental set of historical relations that constitute the subject. It's the subject is implied in the set of relations to begin with. So the things to be analyzed and to be, critiqued or whatever are from the point of view of that kind of blind spot,
right,
of the situation from as understood by through the
right.
lens of the subject.
I guess I was making more of a reference to the Marxist method of political economy as a form of analysis in comparison to Žižek's, or as a way of kind of articulating Žižek's parallax approach to theorizing. Right.
Right. But I think therefore, the status of the subject is so prominent for Žižek, right? And it's not for Marx.
Yeah. But the space, it's like the space between Hegel and Marx and Lacan that it's because it's ultimately not one. Well, I guess in some sense it's all about Hegel, his true love, but that's a kind of way of articulating the impossibility of merely adopting one method of analysis, because analysis also always includes its own possibility for Žižek.
Yeah.
It must include its own possibility, rather. How is the theorist themselves caught up in the political, economic, historical, theoretical process as a kind of moment in it?
Right, which is not something that Heidegger talks about, right?
No.
Well, what's fucking weird about the objet petit, which I think we can tie this all together, is they're still the object. You know what I'm saying? The parallax still there's still the object, but it's never a neutral object. It's the parallax hinges on the idea, what you were just saying about, the intervention of a critique. There's no such thing as a neutral intervention, right? The intervention always has to take into account its position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so there's also no neutral object, because the subject itself, its view, is informed by the object. A viewpoint isn't simply just a position of a subject and the neutral point of an object. Neither positions are neutral. So when you're talking about, this is why historicity, why to historicize historicity itself is any kind of approach, intervention. What's unique to Žižek's style of intervention is that there is almost a self-consciousness about intervention, right? Is that the intervention is informed by the thing that it is intervening towards.
Yeah.
It emerges out of the situation between a non-neutral position, a subjective position, and a non-neutral object. Neither are neutral in this parallax relation.
Yeah, and this is his big problem with object-oriented ontology, is that it doesn't account for who is speaking about these objects.
Yeah, they have the gall to say at the beginning of their books, this book is an attempt to think outside the coordinates of the subject. It's okay, well, who just said that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe when it says this book, it means literally the book, that book.
Yeah, but and then if you go from if you take that fucking logic and you bring it to its absolute end point, this has big fucking implications for the role of the big other. It's where do we even get our language from? Where does our desire? Where's the beginning point of our desire? Right? And Lacan says, I desire the desire of the other, merely the desire of the other. So the external gaze of the big other is as Žižek says, is internal to the subject. It is part of its immanent subjective identity. So, if you bring that logic to its absolute end, in a Lacanian-Hegelian perspective, in that universe, where does your point of articulation? Where is that absolute point of articulation? Where do you begin to intervene? Where does your desire come from? Where does your language come from? And so, there's this always already, as you said, push and pull between the the intervention and what is being and what do I say? Where the thing that's being intervened on?
Yeah, upon, yeah.
like the idea is like, well, how are you even talking about the thing that you're talking about? How is it? Because the objet petit emerges with the object, right? So it's like the idea is that the parallax isn't something that you can pick up and put down. The dialectical materialism isn't something that you're just like, you know what, I'm going to use this as my method. It is always already the method. It is always already what one does when they intervene on any given subject or topic or object within a given set or coordinates of ideology, right? Like,
yes, as a subject. Right?
You're never not parallaxed, you know. The subject
right.
is parallaxed, as is the object. It's immanent to the situation. And so,
and it's always already mediated by the situation.
Exactly. Right? This is why ideology is so fucking crucial to to understanding parallax. It's because it's the condition, right? It's the condition for it. It's ultimately constitutive of the very situation in which we would have a subject-object relation.
But isn't ideology itself always viewed from a particular angle, right? Like, in what sense we gotta because there is. Does it inform the view, or does the view inform the symbolic order, right? Like,
yes.
The answer is yes.
Yeah, the answer is yes.
No, but ultimately,
wait,
ideology
one point about that. You know, Žižek says that, you know, like in some sense, the question of our times is: does the questioning pertain to the subject of the order or to the order itself? Does it pertain to the particular or the universal, the particular or the totality? And he says in this essay, a very interesting point, that distinction is the antagonism of our time. It's both those things. It's the problem itself persists. You don't decide on either one of them, and this is the way that we must relate with the questions as the parallax between the two.
Because ultimately, the question isn't really the particular iteration of the formulation of the question. It's the disjuncture and the tension itself. Because at another point, he says that the main question, like what you're saying there, for Kant's time, was the question between rationalism and empiricism, and all philosophy kind of fell into that distinction, and it was the frame by which Hume, Kant, etc., made their theoretical claims.
And what did Kant do? He resolved them too. He resolved the both of them.
Yeah.
As persisting at once.
The
right?
noumenal phenomenon.
Yeah.
And this antagonism between noumenal and phenomenal, between idealism and materialism, between the particular and the universal, is the antagonism at the heart of, or it's the antagonism that cannot be symbolized, but it gives rise to all symbolic determination. So the idea is that this non-symbolizable difference, this antagonism, right, this contradiction at the heart of any symbolic order is what allows for various ideological pronouncements or determinations or perspectives, which is to say that the parallax is not just a method, right? It is the very position of the subject in an ideological framework. And so why ideology, once again, I'm just going to say why it's so fucking crucial, is because ideology is a way of, I think, corralling, especially hegemonic ideology, is a way of corralling and sort of ordering and forcing a particular parallax viewpoint over the inherent infinite parallax, right? Essentially, the way that I see ideology kind of functioning here is that it addresses the contradiction in a presupposed way. Is that
doesn't it attempt to almost pretend that there isn't is not a contradiction, right? Often,
yeah, right.
Often ideology serves the role to obscure the deep contradictions, say, between classes, for instance.
Right, like in the film All the President's Men, right? The problem with the social order is that the president lied,
lies,
that the press were held at bay from the truth, and it's this process of finding the truth and disseminating the truth, and we fixed politics.
Whereas in the Parallax View, the journalist becomes implicated and controlled by the narrative which he's trying to unravel.
Right, and of course that's a much better description for the position that that big media holds in our society today.
Yeah, you can't get outside ideology is basically what another definition for the parallax is. You can't get outside of ideology, right? Ideology is it's not really our indirect way of accessing the real. The real as a virtual excess gives rise to all ideological fantasies, right? Which is why the necessity to restructure the fantasy seems to be one of the projects of, this kind of like new dialectical materialism. Is like there's a particular fantasy when addressing the original antagonism at the heart of, in this tension between idealism and materialism, between phenomena and noumena. And there's a particular kind of ideological formulation of that antagonism, which tries to obscure that antagonism. But
or rather is a particular iteration of that antagonism.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a distorted version of reality that seems to be very comfortable or easily, a mediation that is comfortable for the hegemony, right? The hegemonic perspective. But I think the idea is a critique that is willing to take up the inherent parallax at the heart of any critique, focuses on that antagonism as the starting place of any critique. I'm sorry if that was a bit of a dog chasing its tail, but
No, I think that's a great point. And it's something that you see at the end of the conversation. Gene Hackman's character tears up his room. He tears up the floorboards trying to find the recording equipment, but you could say trying to find the sort of secret of the kind of situation he's found himself in. And what does he do? He reverts to playing the saxophone, his kind of passive enjoyment of his situation, missing the fact, I think, that the situation was always incomprehensible based on that level of engagement he had with his life. And it doesn't fix it, but it sustains the illusion, onto the next day.
But don't you think that the recording device is in his saxophone?
It is, yeah. It is in the
So the
saxophone.
only thing he doesn't tear up, and then so it's through his enjoyment that he's enacting and participating within that surveillance within the system.
Exactly.
Whoa! Whoa! Hey, I've not seen the movie, but wow,
dude,
okay.
It's a fucking incredible movie.
It's I think it's my favorite movie right now. Which
I think begs the question again is, how do you enjoy? Enjoyment, jouissance is the motherfucking. I'm telling you. If we could figure out a politics of jouissance, then we,
Well, it's
in the non-all, man.
Sorry, it's a great point. I mean, Žižek talks about it in one of his Pervert's Guide films, The Conversation. Like and this is the point that he makes about film, is that cinema teaches us how to desire, and you can see it there in that film. It's this kind of like articulation of our engagement in a situation wherein we can try to understand, we can try to discern what is going on, but we fall into the inconsistencies of the situation itself. And so our reversion back into our just, spontaneous or perhaps not so passive enjoyment is what we get, delivered to us as a kind of lesson. Not to disparage the film itself, but I think in this way, it's like it's a description of the situation. The film is a description, right, or a depiction of it.
Yeah, that movie really affected me. I've only ever seen it once, but it just seared into my mind. To an extension, I'll forget most movies, the week after then. But it's the really great ones that persist, that you keep thinking about.
Maybe we can end it there.
Well, I think we can just kind of sum it up by saying that the parallax is at once an ontological claim about the necessary perspectival nature of making claims about reality and of the subject, and it's also the method by which you make those claims.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's the process, because it's not just a dialectical synthesis,
Mm-hmm.
right, between two opposing viewpoints on the same object. It's
And deciding which one is more correct or something.
right. It's not just but even the dialectical synthesis, would that be that there would be a third truth from the conflict between the two perspectives. It's the truth of the situation is only a result of an irreducible antagonism between those two. So it's not like what is the same about those two perspectives, because the assumption is that two perspectives are talking about the same thing. But the parallax says, because it's a perspective, the object changes as well. So it's no longer the same. It's not the same object being talked about. So it's just the very process of how a position always already changes the thing it's taking a position on.
Right.
And that the thing that it's being positioned, toward also changes the position itself.
And then you wonder, like, okay, what's the medium by which this happens? Like, that seems to be a description of a subjective scenario or situation. But, what Lacan says is that this happens with language, right? This is what language does. That I think could be understood as like the medium, or the medium by which this occurs. And of course,
how does the scenario lend itself to be posited is what I wrote down yesterday. I'm quoting you, but how we determine an object. This is a quote from Will. Everybody, how we determine an object lays bare the activity of the movement to begin with, presupposing the presupposition. Before something is taken up, it must be something that can be taken up. So, how does the scenario lend itself to be posited? And another quote from Will, just to finish off here, folks. Dialectical materialism is the only way you can think. It's not a theory of something, but it's a way a theory is generated. But it is also the theory.
Boom. I would stand behind that.
Who said that? Who said that?
Nice. Well, I think that about sums it up, fellas.
Yeah. Hey, it's been a real treat. We're gonna be back soon. I think we're gonna be talking to Todd McGowan in the next few weeks. We're looking forward to that. And also, Matthew Flissfeeder is coming out with his book. What's his book called? The Algorithmic Desire. So we're going to talk to him about that book, I think.
Yeah, baby.
In late February, early March. Really looking forward to that conversation.
And to end it with a question, is an event a parallax?
I think we should
See you later.
put in the Law and Order